Now, when talking about pan-secessionism, there's really only so much to talk about. There's really only so much to say. And in order to keep this channel, this operation, fresh, you're going to have to talk about some other things in order to keep content interesting, keep content posting, and just have, interesting stuff for myself on this channel. I'm going to have to talk about some other things, but unfortunately, the idea of the All Nations Party is a grand coalition of various groups, and in order to say something interesting, you don't have to say something controversial, but if you're not going to say anything controversial, the range of interesting things to talk about narrows quite a bit. So, unfortunately. But what I want to talk about in this video is a few ideas, is 4 key ideas that I believe have created modern political discourse. And these 4 ideas are the idea of marginal utility, revolutionized economic thought. Even if you have never heard of marginal utility, don't know what it is, it has affected you. Marx's view of antagonistic classes, Freud's idea of the subconscious, and the idea of economic laws, of immutable economic laws. Now, first, we'll talk about Marxism and Freudianism. I see Marx and Freud as similar in the sense that they had a groundbreaking idea. For example, Freud had a groundbreaking idea of the subconscious. Over here, he has this amazing groundbreaking idea, but then he chains or links with that a whole bunch of ideas that people in the field of psychology generally think are kind of crazy. The idea that when you're a little kid, you hold in your poo and you enjoy the feeling of holding in your poo, and that means something. The oral phase, the anal phase, anal retentive, whatever, all Freud's archetypes. So he had a lot of this crazy stuff over here, but what was really groundbreaking about Freud was the idea of the subconscious. And of course, one way to access the subconscious was through dream interpretation. And I think that in dream interpretation is not all that it's cracked up to be. It's not your brain sending messages to you, though you could learn things about yourself from interpreting your dreams, because dreams are kind of an uncensored firing off of stuff that parts of your brain are thinking, but it's not a designed message for you on how to live your life. Anyway, Freud had a great idea, right? Subconscious. Coupled with it, a bunch of crazy ideas that have now been discarded. Marx, I see Marx in a similar vein. Marx had a great idea. Now, what was the great idea that Marx had? Well, the great idea that Marx had was the idea of antagonistic classes as opposed to an ordered and structured society. Right? Prior to Marx, society was viewed as people with their orders, people in various classes, more or less fixed classes, and these classes had their place and they functioned together almost in a emergent design or in a preordained fashion. If you go back to the Middle Ages, you had those who worked, those who prayed, and those who fought, or those who fought and those who prayed. And Marx was saying, no, there is no inherent class ordering of society. There is no inherent harmonious ordering of society. And you can have groups of people that are antagonistic within the same country. And that was a new idea. And, of course, connected to that was a bunch of crazy ideas. And of course, a lot of the ideas that are generally now seen as crazy that Marx held can be understood. For example, Marx held to a labor theory of value. I don't want to try to explain Marx's labor theory of value, because the problem with Marx's labor theory of value is it's complicated, and for me, it's useless. So I end up learning it every time I want to use it, but I don't remember it because I don't continually use it because it's basically useless from my point of view. But and with the idea of the labor theory of value, well, what you have is you have, prior to marginal utility, economists generally held to labor theories of value. Okay? Adam Smith held to a labor theory of value. David Ricardo held to a labor theory of value. A bunch of other people held to labor theory of values. And they can get complicated about it, but basically what they're saying is that the value of a product comes from the labor that was put into it. And they could say, well, maybe not total amount of labor. What is labor? Is it, joules of energy, or is it, okay? But, and people today look at a labor theory of value as being kind of crazy. And just intuitively, how could anyone think that? How could anyone think that a value of something comes from the labor? Obviously, it comes from the inherent value that you project onto it. I don't care if it took you 10 hours to make the Game Boy or 2 seconds, right? And that's a little bit of a straw man of Marx's labor theory of value. But anyway, practically speaking, if you go back to a pre-industrial time, a labor theory of value can make more sense. Now, what you can do is you can gerrymander a particular labor theory of value to where it actually works for a modern industrial economy. But even that is basically, you're getting value for products, but you're doing it backwards, basically. And so it's hardly even a labor theory of value. Anyway, I lost my train of thought. Anyway, when you have, what was I talking about? When you had commodities back in olden times, before industry, prices for things were generally well known. It was generally well known how much effort went into growing X amount of grain, how much effort went into raising these many cows, producing this much milk, this much wool, or whatever. And so in economies that are highly commodified, where the prices of stuff doesn't change much within a person's life, the idea of a labor theory of value, and of course connected to that, the idea of a just price for something, is a bit more functional than one might imagine. Right? And the idea of a just price and a labor theory of value can help, I guess, rural farmers who don't have a whole lot of access to price information. Right? Today we have computers, and before that you had telephones and newspapers, and so access to price information was not particularly difficult. But back in the Middle Ages, a merchant could come in and take stuff from you that you might think is a fair trade based on your limited knowledge of the world, but if you knew the prices of all the things that you're producing, you might think that you're getting gypped. Okay, and so the idea of a labor theory of value, having prices of things based on the labor that went into it, could help a peasant in that way, and it made more sense because you didn't have wild fluctuations in things. You didn't have, for example, when you have a textile mill coming online, you have people who work in a textile mill make as much money in a day as a peasant farmer would have made in 2 weeks, right? And you didn't have these wild variations. There was a lot more parity in terms of the productivity that people could have. The amount of labor that you put into the ground or you put into your flock was pretty closely related to the value of the product of your labor, right? So a labor theory of value was not as dysfunctional or didn't have to be gerrymandered around as much as it would today in order to work, in order to be a functional thing. So Marx came about, and Marx did not hold to the idea of marginal utility. What is marginal utility? Well, the name von Bauer comes to mind for the discovery of marginal utility. Anyway, the idea of marginal utility is diamond-water paradox. Why do people value diamonds more than they value water? Clearly you need water to live, and whereas diamonds, there's some industrial uses for them, but really it's just a shiny rock. why do people value a diamond more than a cup of water when a cup of water is much more necessary for you to live? Well, the reason for this is because you're not making a choice between all the water in the world and all the diamonds in the world. Right? You're making a choice between one cup of water and one diamond. Now, if you were on a planet that was made of diamonds and there's a scarce amount of water, well, then water would be a lot more valuable than the diamonds. Okay? You're buying things on the market. You're not buying every single diamond. You're buying one extra marginal unit of diamonds. You're buying one extra marginal unit of water. Right? So that's how that explains it. And once people were thinking about marginal utility, and people today intuitively understand marginal utility. We live in a highly marketized economy compared to, peasant farmers in the Middle Ages. Okay, we do a lot of market transactions. We look at a lot of prices, going prices for things, and so we develop an intuitive understanding of markets. And even though people have not been told about marginal utility, it's something that people who live in a market economy for a long period of time, they understand. They understand it intuitively. Right? And so we look at the idea of people not knowing about marginal utility, even if we didn't know the name beforehand, as being kind of weird. Well, how could you not? Well, why would they? I mean, they would spend their lives within a 10-mile radius. Why would they know about marginal utility? So, and that revolutionized economics and basically put labor theories of value in the dustbin. And of course, marginal utility was very important because let's say you have people working in a textile mill and then you have people here producing grain. Well, clearly, grain is more important than textiles because you can live without textiles. You can't live without, well, it's not just grain, but let's just say food production. Why are textiles valued more than food production? Clearly, you need food. You can't live without food. You can live without textiles, but yet people spend more on textiles than they do on food. How can that be? Well, you're not making a choice between all the food and all the textiles. You're making choices on the margin, so it makes sense. Moreover, you can also explain wider wealth disparities. You can say, oh, these people, what they produce is worth multiples times more because the value of what they produce doesn't come from the labor, it comes from the buyer's perception. It is subjective. Value is subjective. Value is not tied to labor except to the extent that the labor produces something valuable, right? So it doesn't, I don't care if you do a little jigaboo rain dance to make a Game Boy, or if you have to spend 10 hours to make a Game Boy, it's still a Game Boy. And the Game Boy is going to be valued based on what it can do, not based on the labor that went into it. And that can explain vast wealth disparities and vast income disparities. Well, this person, sure, they work 8 hours a day, but they make a whole lot more money because what they're doing is valued by other people. And this can explain massive wealth disparities in a way that is not necessarily unfair. However, it's much more difficult to do this if you believe in a labor theory of value. And that's, and to be very vague about it, that's why Marxism is so weird. Because what Marx is trying to do is trying to reconcile a theory or a theory of value that works fine pre-industry with an industrial economy where things are far less commodified, right? Where there's far more variation in prices. Also, this thing, the capitalist, starts to come into being, right? And of course, the capitalist is just an emergent planner of the structure of production. Theoretically, I mean, you get crony capitalism today, but just kind of on a theoretical standpoint, capitalist is basically a director. He's not a central planner like from a state, but an emergent planner. And the capitalist is paid in profits or punished in losses based on his ability to basically direct the structure of production in a way that creates more value than there would be if he was not there. Okay, and so you expect to see more capitalists, and and high profits. And then, of course, profits are just the wage of the capitalist. You expect to see these things in new industries. In these new industries, you're going to expect to see more capitalists and higher profits. And of course, as the industry matures, you should see lower profits, assuming the industry is not inherently monopolistic, and fewer capitalists. As the industry becomes more mature, it becomes more commodified and less wild variations in productivity, right? Because of course, because what profits do is they send a signal. They say, hey, there's a lot of money to be made here, and so people start investing in that which creates a lot of profits, which of course drives profits down until eventually profits are, economic profits are driven to zero, and accounting profits are equal across the entire economy. And that's the theory. But of course, if you hold to a labor theory of value, how do you, and of course Marx ultimately believed that the capitalist was owed some recompense, not nearly what they were getting, but that the capitalists did deserve something, that the capitalists were working, they were performing a managerial function, and so they were entitled to some wage, but not nearly as much, because they're not laboring, with 1,000 times as much effort as the average line worker. So why are they getting that much? And so basically, because Marx held to a labor theory of value, he was basically trying to explain industrial economies with a pre-industrial theory of value. And the only thing he could come to, and so the only conclusion he could come to was massive, massive, massive exploitation. Massive surplus value, that is the excess value that the workers were putting into their products, were going to the capitalists. That's the conclusion. That's the only conclusion. It's almost an inescapable conclusion. Now, Marx wrote a huge, long book basically saying why that is an inescapable conclusion, and very few people are actually going to read it. I read through it. I would not say that I read it, right? Because I was reading passages, because, you read a book and, I didn't read the book. I read the PDF. But, you'll go over it and your eyes will read the words, but your brain is not going, right? That's basically how I was with it. So that's Marxism, and the value of Marxism, and the sense in which we are all Marxists today, is that we all hold to the idea of antagonistic classes. In classes, and of course I will go a bit further and say economic classes are not nearly as important as they were, if they ever were as important as they were said to be. But the idea of antagonistic groups of people in a country, that countries are not inherently harmonious, there's not an inherent order to things, that it's groups of people, they can work together, they can fight each other within a country, and to fight each other or to revolt against a state is not a revolt against God, it's not a revolt against the natural order or whatever. They're just classes like that, and that's how people today, everyone thinks that way today. Very few people think in some natural preordained order, right? And that's Marx. And that's Marx who led the way. Now, if there were no Marx, I think that form of thinking would have come about anyway. But Marx is the person that we ascribe. He was the vanguard of that kind of thinking. Okay. So the idea of the subconscious from Freud, the idea of antagonistic classes from Marx, both Freud and Marx had a whole bunch of crazy stuff that they tied in. And the reason all their crazy theories got so much traction is not because those crazy theories were good on their own, but because they were tied to something else, right? Freud's archetypes were tied to the idea of the subconscious. And so people, the subconscious, that was the amazing thing. That was the profound thing that explained so much of the world. Okay, and so, he was right about the subconscious. Maybe we should give his crazy archetypes some currency. Similarly with Marx, the idea of antagonistic classes, that explains a lot. So let's take his idea of the antagonistic classes. Well, maybe all his other crazy stuff about, socially necessary labor time and the different types of value, the objective types of value to explain why what's going on is going on. Let's give that some currency because he was so profoundly right about the antagonistic classes thing. All right. Now, when looking at Marxism, very interesting when you look at the world. Or, well, I'll go through these other things. It's antagonistic classes, the subconscious, marginal utility, and the idea of fixed economic laws. Now, the idea of fixed economic laws, people today, even though they're not, even though they haven't been told what historicism is, and they haven't been told that there was a time when there was a debate between historicists and the classicists and the neoclassicists, people today are basically hold not necessarily to classical or neoclassical economics, but to the idea that economic laws are what they are. That if you set a price ceiling, you're going to have a price ceiling, limit on the price, you're going to have a shortage. Set a price 4, you're going to have a surplus. Yeah, you're going to have a surplus. Right? So, and basically, and that's law, and that's universal. That is always the case. You know, you have X economic laws, you get enough people, then they're going to act, it's going to come about in almost an axiomatic way. There's that idea versus another idea, which is that economic laws are not fixed. And a very broad brush view of what the historians, the most important of these historicists were the German historical school. Of course, there was a London historical school, and there's a bunch of other historical schools. And they held to the idea that economic laws were not set in stone, that responses to policy and responses to incentive were highly culturally dependent. If this school came about today, it wouldn't be called the historical school, it would be called the cultural school. But they would say it's historical factors that influence different people's reaction to policies and economic conditions. And the reason, the historicists would say, the reason that you see so similar reaction to economic conditions and policies between countries like Germany, Britain, France, Italy, Spain, is because these countries had similar historical conditions, or similar enough to where they function close to the same in any given economic environment. Whereas if you have a radically different cultural experience, economic or responses to different economic conditions are going to be radically different dependent on culture. Okay, and eventually the neoclassicals and classicists won out. Basically economists who held more to fixed economic laws, they won out. Now, I think that historicism may be making a bit of a comeback. That's another topic. I'm just saying, for now, the idea of set-in-stone economic laws have more or less won the historical battle. And Marx, in addition to not believing in marginal utility, was also a historicist. Now Marx is interesting because I would consider Marx both a historicist and an anarchist. So, I don't know of anybody who else I would consider a historicist and an anarchist. So, Marx did not believe in fixed economic laws, right? And he believed that you could, by changing the nature of man, you could change the way they respond to economic incentives. And this is crucial in terms of the ability for communism to function and ultimately stateless communism to function. Because, according to Marx, you need to have the new socialist man. Marx never used the term new socialist man, but it's useful to explain what he's talking about. What Marx is basically saying is that you're going to have either a brainwashing program or, it'll be a natural historical progression, a natural historical evolution. Basically, the economic changes will occur. Basically, you'll have the capitalists, then you have the rise up against the capitalists, and then the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then eventually that'll change the economic conditions to where the new socialist man will emerge, and then the state will wither away. And the reason it will wither away is because the people who are in the state, they too have become new socialist men, and they have no desire to rule over others. They're just going to work, and you could say, well, why will people work if they're basically all that they produce goes into a common pot and gets distributed to everyone else? Why would they do that? Clearly, that doesn't work in the world today, right? And Marx didn't say that, oh, that'll work in the world today. Marx didn't think that. He thought that it would work in the world in the future, where people's psychological states and psychological profiles were very different from the people in Marx's time. Right? Brainwashing program or some sort of historical evolution. Basically, the nature of succeeding generations of man will be so different that they will willingly work for the collective. And there will be no need for a state to compel people to work. There will be no need for a state to take the resources and distribute it among people. People will do it themselves. And of course you could say, well, without a state, well, how are they going to deal with violent crime and stuff? Well, that actually gets into another idea. Maybe I should have had 5 key ideas. Anyway. But of course, Marx was around. This was at a time when fewer people knew that you needed a state to have law. Anyway. But Marx was a historicist and a radical blank slater. He had this belief that people could basically become the new socialist man, the new communist thing, and that's why communism could work. And of course, Marx studied in Germany, and I believe he studied under a bunch of historicist professors, and so he was heavily influenced by that. And of course, the end game of the Marx's idea of a progression, Marx's theory of the inevitable revolution, it is basically, I mean, there's all different types of anarchists, but it's close to what anarchists of various types generally believe, which is stateless communism, to varying degrees. You know, everyone's a snowflake. Everyone has their own spin on it, but Marx's final end game is basically anarchism, right? The stateless communism, that's anarchism. Now, when I say stateless communism is anarchism, people who have lived in a country that has a very, very long history of market private property aren't very convinced by the anarchists. And let me explain why. In Britain, at the time of a poet by the name of William Godwin, I believe, I forget what years these were, something like, unbelievable concentration of wealth, like 98% of the land in the hands of like 2% of the population. And this was a result of feudal titles. People just didn't give up land. They inherited land from other people, and so the concentrations were made. So private property in Britain in, say, the year 1700 was not private property in the way we conceive of it. People, and this is what makes the United States exceptional in its history, is that people would just go out, they would homestead some land, and through their use of that land, they would own it. All right? And so private property in the United States didn't have nearly as pejorative a view as it did in Britain, say, the year 1700. Okay? Because in Britain in the year 1700, private property meant feudal land titles. Even after, or basically a continuation of that. Private property was not something the average Joe could have access to. Private property was not something, you know, it was something for the rich. It was something for an elite class, a politically connected class. And another thing, and so and it's also a bit difficult to understand, but at the time, private property and the state were we see a separation of private property and the state, right? But back then, there wasn't such a separation. You could, if you had enough money, you could buy commission in the British Army. Basically, if you had land, you inherited land, you could get into the army and become an officer, not through any merit, but just because you had that land, right? I believe you could buy public office in a few certain places. So property and the state were completely intermingled. Now, you have a bunch of people in Britain, and these people in Britain, they have no experience with private property as it existed in the United States, right? Real private property, homestead property. They had no experience with that. So when they think of private property, they don't think of their private plot that they use. They think of a manorial estate that they're working on 14 hours a day, where 2/3 of what they produce goes to the landlord. That's private property to them, right? It's theft. It's it's a horribly iniquitous system based on a land title that turtles all the way down. So that's the context in which we should look at the anarchists. The anarchists are against private property, the state. Okay. Now, we Americans, in our modern historical context, we see private property and the state as two separate things. And that's why whenever you get corporations buying off politicians or corporations involved in writing legislation, there's such an outcry against that. Because we in the United States, they're supposed to be completely separate things. They're supposed to be separate, right? Private property and the state are separate things. That was not the view in Britain in, say, the year 1700. I might be getting my dates wrong. I might be getting my time frame wrong. But this was true. And so the anarchists saw this private property system as iniquitous, and so they said, abolish private property. Abolish private property, and what will people do without private property? Well, they had no real experience beyond feudalism, or post-feudalism, we'll call it. So what would they do? Well, I guess it'll all become communistic. Maybe you'll have little communes of peasants working together. The manorial estates will go from being this hierarchical thing to being divided and owned amongst the people who were formerly servants on the manor. They're now have all the land will be divided up amongst them, and they'll own it all in common, or not exactly clear in what they were going to do. But they had no conception of private property, of I guess, for lack of a better term, just private property. And so they couldn't see, oh, we're going to replace this post-feudal crap with a just private property system. That was not really in their frame of reference. They could say, oh, we're going to abolish this feudal crap with what? Well, how about it's all held by the workers. It's all held by us, with basically communism. Of course, abolish, and so they're abolishing private property. So, but how does that tie into abolishing the state? Well, private property is the state. See, so they say abolish private property, i.e., abolish the state. In fact, the monarchy itself originated as just a really big private property holder. The king had a demesne, which was his private property, and early on in Britain, the king was to run his national operations from the funding from his demesne, not taxing the other landlords and barons. So the whole system of monarchy originated from a form of private property, right? And that is what they wanted to abolish, and a form of private property that was the state. It was the same thing. And it's kind of a mind fuck to think about it that way if you're living in the modern world today. But that's how it was, right? It was the state. And so when anarchists say abolish private property, abolish the state, that's where they're coming from. That's their frame of reference, because they conflated the two when the two are not necessarily conflated. It was just conflated in their historical experience, and they had kind of a narrow view, and so that's where that came from. And in a place like, Russia, in 1917, I would consider that a post-feudal society. They had a kind of a similar thing, and the anarchists rose up against it. They said abolish private property, have it be owned communally, and so the anarchists took over. Which form of anarchists took over? The Marxist anarchists took over, and of course they had a state, but the idea was eventually the state would wither away. Of course that never happened, and we all know about that. Okay, but another thing that's interesting about the anarchists, and you compare that to people today, is that the anarchists, they didn't know the way we know today that you needed to have a state in order to have law. See? If you look at the history of states, going, the Pharaoh, Babylon, look at all these ideas of states, they came from religion. Now, I believe that ultimately the origin of the state was not originally through conquest. Now, states, once formed, could go out and conquer areas, even stateless areas, and subdue them, and eventually be able to start making profits off of them through taxes. But the origins of state de novo, I believe, came from religion, that states could not form de novo from conquest. Now, once formed, they could then go conquer, and that includes conquering non-state areas. But the original inception of states, I believe, came from religion, and there's evidence. One of that is that all states universally justify themselves from religion. Two, all states say that they grew out of a religious cult, not from conquest. They all say that, right? That's their self-proclamation. Okay, and three, there's little evidence of large-scale wars until long after the states came into being. I'm being quite vague about that, but anyway, that's not what I'm talking about here. For most of the history of states did not justify themselves on the basis of them being necessary to provide law, or them being optimal for the peasantry, right? They justify themselves as being ordained by God / the gods, right? Where did Hammurabi's code come from? Well, it came from the sun god, something, 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 right? The dynasty in Japan ruled because they were descendants from the sun god. Okay, and so, the tribe that ruled amongst the Inca, they were not descended from the sun god, but from a god that had a relation to the sun god, and they were basically ruling instead, something like that. Same in the Aztecs, ruled not from the sun god, but from a bunch of different gods that made a deal with the sun god. You can look this up. I don't need to explain that here. But it's all God, 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 God. God's, why are we in charge? Why can we rule? Because God, right? The caste system in India, why is that? God. Why did the emperor rule in China? Well, because the mandate of heaven, right? And if the emperor ruled in a bad way, the mandate of heaven could be revoked. But his original, claim to power came from God, right? It's God, God, God. It was not, we need to have these states come into power in order to provide legal services. And in fact, I believe there's quite a bit of evidence that law predated states. And in fact, this is becoming less and less controversial of a statement. I think a few years ago when I was making it, it was seen as kind of controversial. But I don't know if it's even very controversial anymore to say that law preceded states. So when people in, say, Britain in the year, let's go back even further, let's say to 1500, and that's another thing to consider, is that in Britain, most of the peeps working on their farms, they did not have access to either the king's law or the church law. They had access to neither. So when they had a dispute with another person, how they solved it amongst themselves. and of course this kind of stuff was not recorded, and most historians didn't really bother talking much about this period of time, because why would they? They're peasants, they're commoners. Who cares about what people are interested in? What the courts do. People are interested in what the dynastic feuds between the nobility and the wars and all that stuff. That's what, at the time, that's all they cared about, because they didn't have this egalitarian notion that modern people have about, what did the great masses look like? Who cares? Who cares? They're just scrubs. They produce stuff for the nobility, and the nobility, we're the ones who do all the cool stuff. Right? Anyway, so they would have these disputes, and so this apparently this amazing fact that these peasants were resolving all their disputes and having law amongst themselves without any monopolist on law, without the king or the church enforcing the law, they were doing it just fine. Now, if you told the kings then, at the time, that was going on, they wouldn't really care. They wouldn't be like, oh no, now they know that they can survive without me. No, that didn't matter, because the basis of their power wasn't based on them being necessary or optimal. It was based on them. It was based on the divine right and something about like a chain of being or some stupid shit. But basically, the reason that and ultimately, well, I think it's how did it go? God, Pope was the representative, God's representative on earth, and Pope kinged people. Pope was the kingmaker, and so your rule came from God. Basically, God. That's why I'm king, because God. So when they saw that these people could have law without the king's law, without the church law, it didn't faze them, because it didn't undermine the basic ideology of the state. If that was happening today, you had people having law without, the United States federal government, completely, or any other level of government having anything, that would be an embarrassment, because the justification for modern democratic states is that they make life better, and that, without a state you're not going to have law. But they didn't know this at the time, and they didn't need that, because that was the justification was completely different, right? Of course, what you have is, and of course over time, monarchies went away. The revolution of the anarchists kind of came, and you saw the anarchists saying abolish the state and have communism and abolish private property, i.e. the state. And you saw a rise in anarchism. Though anarchism didn't win out, ultimately the monarchies fell, right? And so the rise of anarchism can be seen as a symptom of a general public sentiment that these monarchies are kind of bullshit, and these post-feudal land systems are kind of bullshit. So, and following this, and in a sense, you had a anarchism light following the fall of monarchies, which is, of course, democracy. I call it anarchism light, or you could say a la carte anarchism, or i.e. a la carte communism, in that it's not that everything is to be held in common. But anything that is voted to be held in common is held in common, right? So it's not it's not complete and total communism. It's a la carte communism. It's communism to the degree that the voters decide to have communism, and so that's ultimately what won out. So basically, a form of communism, democracy, did win out, and so so I basically see communism, anarchism, and democracy as three sides of the same three-sided object. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about is cultural Marxism. Short course on cultural Marxism. I'm sure a bunch of people have already seen this. People watch this video are kind of bored of it, but basic idea of cultural Marxism is that something embarrassing happened with Marxist theory. Marxist theory was that you'd have the communist revolution in industrial societies. Marx predicted it would first hit the most industrial society, Britain, right? Britain. But it didn't. It hit a backward society. It hit Russia, and later on it hit China, which was a very backward society at the time that they had their communist revolution. What was going on? This didn't make much sense at all. right? The Marxist theory says that it's going to hit the industrial societies, not the backward agricultural societies, because it's going to hit the industrial societies, and the reason for that is because in the industrial societies, that's where you have all the capitalists, and that's where you have the huge wealth disparities and all the surplus labor going to the capitalists. The landlord, the feudal landlord, didn't take as big of a percentage of the surplus labor from the workers as the capitalists do. All right, Marxist theory was that the internal discontinuity, or the internal contradiction in that sense, between the labor theory of value and the massive money of the capitalists, that would eventually lead to the collapse. But because in an agricultural feudal society, you do have huge wealth inequalities, but in terms of a percentage, the total of surplus value that the landlord is getting off of the serfs, it's less than what the capitalist gets off of his line workers, right? Because Marx doesn't really get that. I already went over that. So when you have communist revolutions happening in Russia, that's an embarrassment. And moreover, and they were looking at World War I, right? World War I was boiling up. All the Marxists were like, all right, this is it. It's go time. The countries are more industrial than ever before, and now they're going to have a great big war. They're going to send all their workers to go kill each other and shoot each other for the capitalistic interests, which I believe there is some truth to. But I think most of the causes for World War I were not a result of capitalistic interests, but were a result of just plain old, flag nationalism. And the working class did not rally around the classes. They did not develop class consciousness. They developed nation consciousness. And they went in and they fought each other, and they identified it not as working class, but as German. Not as working class, but as French. And they fought wars on those grounds. It was a failure, right? It was a complete failure. And a complete refutation of communist theory of what would happen. And so, what was the problem? Why was communism taking root in Russia, but not taking root in Britain, Germany, and France? Right? And definitely not in the United States. Why? Why? Well, the idea was that, there must be something in the way, some sort of barrier that needs to be broken down. A barrier that Russia did not have, but a country like Germany did have. What is that? What separates Germany from Russia so profound, and Germany from Britain even more profoundly? What is that barrier? And they came to the idea, private property. Moreover, not this post-feudal crap, but more of a just private property system. Right, that was a barrier. The petty bourgeois. Not post-feudal land titles, but kind of petty bourgeois private property. That's the problem. So you need to break down, not the big-time capitalists, but like the small-time capitalists, the small business owners, and the man who owns his ranch and maybe employs 2 or 3 farm hands or something, right? The petty bourgeois. Okay, so that needs to be broken down. National identity, that needs to be broken down. In Russia, you didn't have quite as much national identity as you did in countries like Germany, France, or even Italy, or definitely Britain. So there was less national identity in Russia. So, we need to break down national identity. They were rallying around these national identities. Those need to be broken down. So break down the petty bourgeois, break down small business ownership, break down the middle class. Right? Because when you break down the middle class, then what you have is you have the working class and the capitalists, and then there's that conflict, that more of a hard break conflict, and there's these petty bourgeois, this middle class that gums up the works, right? So you need to break down the middle class, you need to break down national identities, you need to break down racial identities as well. All this idea of separate races, because a race is like a flag nation, right? It's something that people rally. It's some identity other than class, right? Race consciousness, it gets in the way of class consciousness, right? And so that's why they want to eliminate race consciousness. Or that's why they wanted to at the time. Now, of course, you could say the converse. Class consciousness breaks down race consciousness, right? And so some people may say, we need to say boo to class because that divides the race, right? Whereas these people say boo to race because that divides the class. Okay. And then it was, say, religion, break down religion, because religion, that's another thing to rally behind other than the class. And what religion does is it kind of makes people put up with a lot more crap than they would, because they're thinking, I'm here on this world. Everything in this world is preordained. My life is designed by God. And once I get through this, if I play my cards right, I'm going to get into heaven, and it's going to be eternity forever. So that's what people are thinking. Okay, life sucks now, but when I die, I'm going to go to heaven, and it's just going to be great. That's what they're thinking. So that causes people to put up with a lot more crap. And because they think that everything in their life has a meaning and is or preordained or you know, God's in control somehow, that makes them put up with it more and makes them feel more comfortable about this current situations. And so break down religion, and you're going to break down the complacency that comes from religion, right? Marx said is an opiate of the masses, and those are the two reasons why it is kind of an opiate of the masses. So you also want to break down religion. And those are really the big four. Break down the petty bourgeois, break down national identity and racial identity, and religion. And then there's like break down gender, patriarchy. I'm not sure. I don't know. I know that feminism was not that big of a deal in the early Frankfurt School, because the early Frankfurt School was the reason they were saying to do all these things. The reason they were saying, and this is critical theory, the reason they were saying to break all these things down was so that you could break down other identities other than class, in order to generate more class consciousness, in order to lead to the ultimate communist revolution. That was the original idea for all these things. Now, once this ball was rolling, it kind of developed, you know, a force of its own. And now, and it led to what we call today political correctness. But political correctness today, I mean, people today who say, you know, let's battle racism, and racism is bad, and let's break down racial identity. These people, they're not thinking, let's do that so then we could usher in the communist revolution. That's not what they're thinking, okay? That's the origin, but that's not what they're thinking. That's not why, okay? And so today you have people saying, oh, let's have, you know, gay rights, okay? Or let's have, you know, transgender weird sex thing, right? Let's give votes to women. Let's give women rights, okay? Did that come, the people who are saying let's give, how does giving women rights, how does that aid in the communist revolution? It doesn't really, okay? So those are examples of things that came later on as cultural Marxism developed almost a life of its own, and so people began to start advocating for things like women's rights, not because it would assist in some global communist revolution, but because they thought that was a good idea as an end in itself, right? And so it kind of developed, it was almost like a flywheel that pushed it on its own. So that would be another thing. So actually, not 4 ideas, 6 ideas. 6 ideas that really gave us modern politics. One is antagonistic classes, came from Marx. 2 would be the subconscious, that came from Freud. 3rd would be marginal utility, that came from Baumbach and some French guy. 4th would be the idea of hard economic laws. Let's say, came up with that, like Smith and Ricardo, I believe. The idea of hard economic laws as opposed to historicism, culturally dependent economic laws. The 5th key idea that creates modern politics is the idea that law requires a state, and a state is necessary for law. A state, i.e. a monopoly on law, is necessary to have law. Without a monopoly on law, you have no real law. And the 6th idea is critical theory, cultural Marxism, or political correctness. That's like the 6th thing that really shapes modern political discourse. So those are what I consider the big 6. Not sure what I'm going to title the video or how to even end the video, because I'm basically done with all the things that I'm saying and I didn't really think about a conclusion. So in conclusion, this video is concluded.